On a beach in Antarctica, a mother penguin returns from the sea to a colony of 500,000 birds. Every one of them looks almost exactly the same. Every one of them is screaming. And somewhere in that deafening chaos of identical black and white bodies is one specific chick. She has no name to call out, no landmark to follow, no face she'd recognize. And yet, within minutes, she finds it. Not a chick, her chick. The question is, how does an animal buried in a crowd of thousands know which one belongs to it? And what does it mean that it cares? This is one of the strangest abilities in all of nature, and it hides in plain sight. We call it kin recognition, the capacity to identify your own relatives and reliably tell them apart from everyone else. It sounds simple. It is anything but. Let's start with what we actually know. For humans, recognizing family is mostly a matter of faces, voices, and shared history. You know your sister because you've seen her 10,000 times, but most animals don't have any of that to work with. A penguin can't possibly rely on a familiar face inside a crowd of 500,000 nearly identical faces. A newborn ground squirrel has never even met most of its own relatives. And yet, over and over, creatures solve a problem that should be impossible. They pick out their own blood from a sea of strangers. So how do they actually do it? The answer for a huge number of species isn't sight, and it isn't sound alone. It is smell. It is chemistry. Every animal carries a kind of scent signature, a personal chemical fingerprint shaped partly by its genes. And here is the key. The closer two animals are related, the more similar those signatures are. A mother can learn her offspring's specific individual scent in the very first hours after birth, and then lock onto that signal for life. That is what the penguin is really doing on that beach. Underneath the chaos, she isn't looking. She is smelling and listening for a signal she memorized days earlier, a call and a chemistry that belonged to one chick out of 500,000. Biologist Bruce Waldman spent years studying this strange ability in tadpoles, of all unlikely creatures, and he found something startling. Tadpoles could sort themselves, choosing to gather near their own siblings over unrelated tadpoles, even when they'd been separated at hatching and had never once interacted. They had never met their brothers and sisters, and still, somehow they knew. The recognition wasn't learned through familiarity. It was written into their chemistry, waiting to be read. But here is where it gets complicated and important, because recognizing your kin isn't just a clever party trick. It sits at the very center of one of the deepest forces in all of biology, why animals are ever willing to sacrifice for each other at all. Think about the Belding's ground squirrel. When a dangerous predator approaches the group, one squirrel will often stand straight up and let out a loud, piercing alarm call, warning all the others of the threat. But that call is dangerous. It draws attention. It marks the caller as a target. By every logic of self-preservation, the squirrel should stay silent and save its own skin. And yet it screams the warning anyway. Biologist Paul Sherman studied these particular squirrels for years, and what he found was remarkable. The squirrels giving those risky alarm calls weren't doing it randomly or indiscriminately. They called far more often and far more readily when close relatives happened to be nearby. Their sisters, their mothers, their daughters. When only unrelated strangers were around, the calls dropped off sharply. The squirrel wasn't simply being brave for bravery's sake. It was performing a kind of unconscious genetic math, risking its own individual life, but specifically and precisely to protect its own genes, the copies of them carried inside the bodies of its family. This is the idea that reshaped modern biology. A creature can pass its genes to the next generation two ways: by having its own young, or by helping its relatives survive to have theirs. Which means kindness toward family isn't separate from survival. It is survival, running one level deeper, and absolutely none of it works. None of it can even get started, unless the animal is first able to answer one crucial question: who exactly counts as my family? And the sheer length that animals will go to in order to answer that one question are genuinely staggering. Consider the Mexican free-tailed bat. A mother bat flies back into a cave that can hold up to 20 million other bats, with the pups packed thousands to a single square foot of ceiling, a churning, screaming, living carpet of nearly identical babies. For decades, scientists simply assumed she must feed whatever nearby pup she happened to land beside. It seemed impossible she could ever find her own baby in that. But when researchers finally tested it, they found these mothers locate their own pup around 99 times out of 100, using a memorized call and scent. In the single most crowded nursery on the entire planet, she almost never gets it wrong. Or consider the salmon. Born in a tiny specific freshwater stream, it swims out into the sheer, terrifying vastness of the open ocean and spends years of its life out there, traveling 1,000 miles or more from where it began. And then, when the time finally comes to reproduce, It turns itself around and finds its way all the way back, not just to the correct river system, but often to the very same specific stretch of stream where it originally hatched. And part of how it manages this is, once again, scent, as a baby it imprinted on the exact chemical signature of its home waters, then carried that memory across an entire ocean and back. It is recognizing not a relative this time, but a birthplace, home itself, encoded as a smell, and remembered faithfully for a whole lifetime. And then there is the flip side of kin recognition, the darker and more surprising part that we talk about far less often. Because it isn't only ever used to help family, it is also used, just as powerfully, to avoid them. In species after species, animals show a quiet, built-in resistance to mating with close relatives. They have no idea what a cousin even is. They've never been taught anything about genetics. But they can sense, often through that same scent chemistry, when a potential mate is too closely related and they steer away. It is called inbreeding avoidance, and it quietly protects the next generation from all the serious damage that comes when a family tree folds too tightly in on itself. The very same signal that says this one is precious, worth protecting, also says this one is not for mating. The same information, read off the same chemistry, and it drives two of the most important decisions an animal will ever make in its entire life. But here is where science slams, once again, straight into a wall. Because absolutely everything I've just described is behavior. We can watch the penguin find her chick. We can carefully measure which squirrels give the alarm call, and precisely when. We can prove, with hard data, that the bat locates her own specific pup. What we cannot do is climb inside the animal's mind and find out what any of it actually feels like, or whether it feels like anything at all. When that mother penguin finally finds her chick, is she flooded with something we'd recognize as relief, as love? Or is she just an extraordinarily precise biological instrument, executing a scent-matching program with no inner experience behind it? Does the ground squirrel actually feel protective of its sister? Or is feeling simply the wrong word entirely for whatever is really happening inside it? We genuinely, honestly don't know. The recognition itself is real and measurable and undeniable, but the experience that may or may not lie behind it is sealed off from us completely. And yet, it is very much worth noticing exactly where this ability shows up in its richest forms, because the animals with the richest family lives, elephants, primates, wolves, don't just recognize their kin chemically. They remember specific individuals for decades. They grieve them. They favor them. An elephant can recognize the distant call of a family member it hasn't heard in years. That is not just a simple scent, matching reflex firing away blindly in the dark. That starts to look like something much closer to genuine knowing. So maybe kin recognition runs along a spectrum. At one end, a tadpole drifting toward chemical siblings it will never consciously understand. At the other, an elephant that remembers its mother's voice for a lifetime. And somewhere in between, biology quietly turns into something that starts to resemble what we call family. We spent a very long time assuming that only human beings truly understood family, that everything else out there was just blind, mechanical instinct. But the closer and more honestly we look, the more that confident line blurs and softens. The penguin on the beach, the bat in the roaring cave, the salmon crossing an entire ocean just to come home. Not one of them was ever taught what family means. And still, every single one of them spends its whole life finding its way back to it. So the next time you watch an animal move through a crowd of its own kind, remember what is really happening underneath the surface. It isn't lost. It isn't guessing. Out of thousands upon thousands of others, it is quietly, unerringly holding on to the precious few that are its own. Not a chick, her chick. And whatever that recognition ultimately is, instinct, chemistry, or something we don't yet even have a proper word for, it may well be the very same thing that pulls all of us, quietly and constantly, toward the ones we belong to.